And now it's my pleasure to introduce Beverly Robinette to you. Many of you know Beverly from time past. She is a former Methodist minister and served at Emory and Henry and other places, or she will tell you all about that. Beverly?
Those of you who have heard me before know I usually don't come empty-handed because I think people experience things all different ways, visually and orally, and so I try to create that experience. Before I begin, though, I just want to say thank you for the privilege of coming once again. It has been a couple of years since I have stood behind this stand, and I thank WAVA and others for not giving up on me. Every year they would send a lovely email and say, Beverly, we really would like you to come. And, life was sort of unfolding in its own unique, special way for me. And I felt that there was some time that I needed just to sort of sit back and be on my own journey. But I'm back and have agreed to come a couple of times this year. And it's always such a gift to be here, and you all are so gracious when I do come. I will tell you a little bit about me because I see some faces in this room that are new to me. I am a native of Big Stone Gap, Virginia, so I am a Southwest Virginia girl. Graduated from what is no longer Powell Valley High School, and graduated from Emory and Henry College. So I truly am I was made in this area. My father is a native of Scott County, my mother a native of Dickinson County for generations. Left the area, was one of those who felt that she was tired of the mountains and wanted to go and experience the world, and moved to Washington, D.C. I was an accounting undergrad. Don't ask me why, but also French. I was one of those eclectic college students who really didn't know what she wanted to do. But I got a job in Washington, D.C. as an auditor. And as I tell people, my job was to go out and make people feel good about the fact that auditors were in their building, because I had such a good personality. And so I was sort of like the front person to go out and help calm people down that the auditors were here. After 3 years, I realized that auditing probably wasn't what I was supposed to do for the rest of my life, although it paid the best money that I'll ever get paid in my whole professional career. I went back to school in Atlanta, Georgia, to Emory University, and got my Master of Divinity, and was ordained in the United Methodist Church, where I served as a pastor in several different locations: Cleveland, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, and then got a call to come home to Emory and Henry. I was very privileged to serve there for 6 years as the pastor of the Emory Church on the campus, and a small chapel a mile from the campus, Smith Chapel, and loved it there. But also, my father and mom would just shake their heads and say, "We love you anyway," because I decided that being a minister and serving in that capacity wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I went back to school and got my master in social work, and currently am a clinical therapist in Abingdon, working with lots of different folks. The place where I ended up, though, specializes working with children who have been hurt and who act out of that hurt. So I am very honored to work with children and adolescents who are very wounded. And hopefully within the next couple of months, I will get to sit for the LCSW exam. And then I don't know what school I'm going to go to next. My brother says I'll be getting Social Security as a student, and I think he might be right. But along the way, I mean, the thing about someone who has passion for different things, I've never lost my passion for talking and sharing thoughts and ideas and beliefs and feelings with people, and you all have opened up a venue. I didn't leave the church because I didn't love preaching. I left the organized sort of mainline church because I could no longer preach what they told me to. And so I thank you for letting me be here, where I can be more authentic in who I am as on my spiritual path and who I am as a person. I'm going to also invite you, before I get started, to sit back and relax for a moment. We're going to be talking about recipes for a sacred life. And one of the ways that I experience my understanding of sacred is through music. And I thank Karen. It's for such a beautiful voice and the willingness to share your gift. And I thank you. But I would like you also to sort of center yourselves and just enjoy these next few moments as I bring us to a time of reflection. Come and find the quiet center in the crowded life we lead. Find the room for hope to enter. Find the frame where we are freed. Clear the chaos and the clutter. Clear our eyes that we can see all the things that really matter. Be at peace and simply be. Silence is a friend who claims us, cools the heat and slows the day. God it is who speaks and names us, knows our being, touches base, making space within our thinking, lifting shades to show the sun, raising courage when we're shrinking, finding scope for faith begun. In the Spirit, let us travel, open to each other's pain. Let our loves and fears unravel, celebrate the space we gain. There's a place for deepest dreaming. There's a time for heart to care. And the Spirit's lively scheming, there is always room to spare. Amen. As I began thinking about today and what I wanted to talk about, it was right around the Christmas time, and one of my favorite uncle, if I must be honest, my Uncle Steve, had given my daughter Clara a book for Christmas, and Clara, being an English major, just shook her head and handed it to me and said, "Mom, not till the summertime." She has about 30 books to read this semester. But it's entitled Recipes for a Sacred Life. And the author, and I may not be pronouncing her name correctly, is Revi Neshama. And, I sort of, went and sort of thumbed through it and went, oh, this is, going to be a really nice little, God loves you and this is the way you should live book. Because my family that I love very dearly are very, very set in the Christian tradition. My maternal grandparents were primitive Baptists, so when I start beating on the pulpit, you'll know why. So I wasn't sure what type of book Steve had gotten for my daughter, but I was just delighted and realized that he knew my daughter better than I thought he did. I didn't give him credit because the author comes from brings a lot of different traditions to her writing. There are Christian traditions, but also Buddhist traditions and Native American traditions. I mean, it's a wonderful sort of spiritual book rather than a specific religious book. And it's like a meditation. There's like 1-2 page little meditations that you could read every day. But she talks about the reason she wrote this is that she was sort of reflecting on her own life and what parts of her life had a deeper meaning than other parts. And so I wanted to read for you in her introduction. She sort of defines what she understands a sacred life to be, which I guess you could take the life out and maybe what she understands sacred to be. And I thought it would be a good sort of starting point at the beginning of 2015 to invite all of us here to maybe re-reflect on that, because I know that all of us, if you are on a spiritual journey or you are intentional about that part of your life, that this is not a new topic, but it's one that it's oftentimes important to think about. And so Reeve writes, "My highest purpose is to live a sacred life," and this is how she defines it: connected to others, nature, and the divine through love, gratefulness, and service. Connected to others, nature, and the divine through love, gratefulness, and service. So I thought that it would be really interesting today, and I hope that I'm going to really be careful about the clock because I love to talk, and I want to provide opportunity for us to have conversation, because I always learn so much when I come here from those of you who are okay with sharing your wisdom about your life's journey. But I thought it would be interesting to sort of take time to reflect on what we understand the recipes for our sacred life to be. So props numbers 1 and 2. How many of you recognize this? What is that? It's a recipe file. And it's a metal recipe file. This is my mother's recipe file. My mother died in April of 2012, and I was the honored recipient, or maybe I should be honest and say I took it. But everyone knows I have it, so they can borrow it at any time. But this is my mother's recipe file. I have known this recipe file since I was a baby. If you would look at my mother's recipe file, it's in alphabetical order. And almost every card, do you remember these? Oops, don't lose that. This is a recipe card, and that is my mother's handwriting. And so I have all of these recipes that I remember eating as a child. And I've looked at the recipes, and I realized that my mother didn't always go by the recipe. And because she realized that there were things that you could add or detract from a recipe to make it better or make it different. But I just love the fact that my mother was so organized. So when I was about 17, my mother gave me a gift. Because she wanted me to be a good wife and mother and housewife. So guess what? This is Beverly's recipe file. And look at it. There are like 5 cards that are in my handwriting. When I would find a good recipe, rather than taking the time like my mother did and write it out and say who it was from, either my aunt or my grandmother or friends from Big Stone Gap. So many women friends of my mother's, I have recipes. I just stuck it in there, going, I'll do this later when I have time. Well, this is 40 years later, and it's still like this. But it's still precious to me because it's still handwriting that I recognize from people that I know. And do I follow every recipe exactly the way it's written? No. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I add and detract. And that's what we do with recipes. And I think that, as much fun as allrecipes.com is for me, I have my own little recipe file on allrecipes.com. I often get out my mother's recipe file just to see her writing. As wonderful as technology is, and we're able to access any recipe at any time, anything you want to make, I think sometimes we've lost that connection with the personal. So these are my recipe files, because we're going to be talking about the recipe for our sacred life. And each one of us, if I went around the room and asked you what your recipe for your sacred life was, you would all have a different answer, because most likely all of you would have a different understanding of the word sacred. When I was growing up, I thought there was only one definition of sacred. And that's one of the major changes in my spiritual journey. I thought sacred had to do with the church. That everything that was sacred had to be inside the four walls of the church where I grew up, where there was a lot of love and a lot of laughter, but it was extremely rigid. And everything that was inside the church was sacred, except for prayer. I think you could take prayer outside the church, because I was supposed to pray every day, and that could be considered sacred. But, everything else that was sacred was in the church. And so my journey, of course, has been to realize, sacred for me is probably everywhere but the church in many ways. But there's still sacredness there. But I've also realized there's not just one definition of sacred. All of us have that understanding of what sacred means to us, whether sacred is connected to a higher being, whether you call that higher being God, or the holy, or she who is, or whatever that is, or nothing. You don't have that name. Whether sacred is connected to relationships, whether sacred is connected to nature, it's whatever it is that you feel is sacred. And it's not to be taken lightly. It's not that everything can be sacred, but maybe everything can be, depending on your journey. When I was trying to think about my own definition of sacred to bring to you today, because it would be sort of, hard to talk about the recipes for a sacred life and me not have a definition of sacred, I really don't have words right now for what is sacred, but I have a visceral feeling for what is sacred to me, and the things that pull me in that place and pull outside of me and connect me to something that is outside of me, whether that is a song or a reading or something visual. I remember driving home from Abingdon. I work in Abingdon and live in Bristol, and I was driving home this past week. We were going paperless in our office. Do you know what that means? There's a lot of upfront entering of everything into a computer system, and I was there late, and the sun had already almost set. And I was driving west on 81, and the top side of the sky was an indigo blue, but right on the horizon there was a pink, and Venus was directly ahead of me. And as I was driving, and I don't drive with the radio on anymore, I drive in silence, I started crying, because that visceral place inside of me connected with what I was seeing, and I was in a sacred moment. Now, that doesn't mean that every time I drive from from Abingdon to Bristol, I experience sacred moments, but that was sacred. Something inside of me spoke or responded in a nonverbal way. There are some people there are some authors that I want to read for you. There's lots of different books on sacred. Everyone wants to tell you what sacred is. I'm not going to tell you what your sacred is, but I want to share with you some of my recipes so that maybe it will prompt you to think about what is it in your life that makes you respond with something that there are no words. And here's Annie Dillard, one of my favorite authors, and this is from For the Time Being. Annie writes, There is no less holiness at this time, as you are reading this or hearing it, than there was on the day the Red Sea parted, or that day in the 30th year in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as Ezekiel was a captive by the river Shaban, when the heavens opened and he saw visions of God. There is no whit less enlightenment under the tree at the end of your street than there was under Buddha's bow tree. In any instant, the sacred may wipe you with its finger. In any instant, the bush may flare, your feet may rise, or you may see a bunch of souls in trees. N. Scott Momaday writes, "To encounter the sacred is to be alive at the deepest center of human existence. Sacred places are the truest definitions of the earth. They stand for the earth immediately and forever. They are its flags and shields. If you would know the earth for what it really is, learn it through its sacred places. At Devil's Tower or Canyon de Shelly or the Cahokia Mounds, you touch the pulse of the living planet. You feel its breath upon you. You become one with the spirit that pervades geologic time and space." And finally, one that I thought was very interesting. I had heard about this book. I never read it. A.J. Jacobs wrote, "The Year of Living Biblically, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Bible as Literally as Possible," which I think would just be an amazing book to read. If you ever have read parts of the Old Testament and think that you could live it literally, the one thing I did want when I was a young seminary student and realized that women could have their own tent in the backyard and live there for at least 7 days out of the month and not have to be, bothered with the men, and sometimes even with the older children, because when they were in that time of the month, they were, of course, unclean, and they had to live in a separate quarters. And I'm thinking, I wouldn't mind having a red tent in the backyard where I could because that's when they rested. That's when they rested and were able to sort of, be their own selves. But this is what Mr. Jacobs writes, which I thought was really a good thought about what sacred is. "Each cherry took about 3 seconds to eat. 3 seconds to eat, but at least 5 years in the making. It seemed unfair to the hard-working cherry tree. The least I could do was to devote my attention to the cherry in those 3 seconds, really appreciate the tartness of the skin and the faint crunching sound when I bite down. I guess it's called mindfulness, or being in the moment, or making the mundane sacred. Whatever it is, I'm doing it more. Like the ridiculously extended thank you list for my hummus, the fruit taboo made me more aware of the whole cherry process, the seed, the soil, the 5 years of watering and waiting. That's the paradox. I thought religion would make me live with my head in the clouds, but as often as not, it grounds me in this world." So those are just some thoughts about what sacred is and what can be added to a recipe file for a sacred life. As many of you know who have heard me before, although I no longer am an acting minister, I'm still ordained in the Methodist Church. I have, even though I went through my own sort of spiritual path, my spiritual quest, I still cannot live a life that is devoid of yearning and searching for something more than just living day to day. And I can't tell you what it is. I don't always call it God anymore. I struggle with that word. But I am primitive Baptist in my core, so there's a part of that still lives in me. But there is a part of me that still yearns to connect, and I guess it's that connectedness, to connect with something that is outside myself, to connect with other people. Relationships have become primary for me, and I've learned that at the feet of some wonderful people in my life, my mother being probably the most important person who taught me that it was about loving other people, not loving them unconditionally, not holding them accountable, because she held me accountable plenty times. But it was loving them because of who they were. It was having professors at Emory and Henry. The reason I went to Emory and Henry, I'll tell you, I was a freshman at Tech. And if you're a Tech grad, yay, go Tech. It was a very great learning experience for me, but coming from a class of 124 students and being a grape juice, diet right kind of girl and going to Tech when 18 was a legal drinking age, it was a little bit of a culture shock. Did you know that college kids drink? And that they drink even when it's not legal for them to drink? And it was quite a huge thing to be in a class of 4,000. And so there were a lot of things that, a lot of reasons why Tech and I didn't fit. And so I came to Emory and Henry and visited the summer between my freshman and sophomore years and met one of my best friends. She was one of the students that was doing the little tours on campus. But the thing that made me decide to go to Emory and Henry was not the tour. It was not all the people who were alums from Big Stone going, you got to go to Emory and Henry. It was the phone calls I received the weeks after I went on the tour from professors who said, I understand that you're interested in coming, and I just wanted to call and to say it would just be so delightful to meet you. And I understand that you enjoy French, and I'm the French professor, and I just want to tell you that I would love to have you as a student. I'm going, don't you want the last 4 digits of my social security number? Because that's how professors knew me at Tech, except for the ones I sat outside their door every day to get help on calculus. So it was those relationships that made me, and then it was the relationships I made with people there, including my dear husband, that made me stay and know that this was the place for me. So relationships, that connectedness is one of the things that makes isn't part of my recipe file. And that understanding of relationship, of course, has changed over the years. Another recipe that I have is poetry. How many of you love poetry? How many of you know Mary Oliver? Mary Oliver. Steve Fisher, one of my dear friends, introduced me to Mary Oliver. So I'm going to read for you. This is a book that Mary Oliver wrote called Why I Wake Early. It's a beautiful book of her poetry. And this is her very first poem. It's the title poem. And I just want to read it. It's very short. This is Why I Wake Early. And this is one of my sacred recipes. Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who make the morning and spread it over the fields and into the faces of the tulips and the nodding morning glories and into the windows of even the miserable and the crotchety. Best preacher that ever was, dear star that just happens to be where you are in the universe to keep us from ever darkness, to ease us with warm touching, to hold us in the great hands of light. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Watch now how I start the day in happiness and kindness. Now, I do know that not all of you are morning people, so Why I Wake Early may not seem so appealing to you, but it's a beautiful poem about how to greet every day. And for me, that touches that deep place in me. Some other ways that I experience the sacred are my children. They would be mortified if I brought them here as props, so I did not. My daughter is 7 hours away and probably glad this morning. My son is maybe still in bed, I don't know. But they are not sacred to me every moment, but they certainly evoke that part in me at the most unexpected moments. I'll share one story about Clara. She gave me permission. It just happened. I turned 51 this past Monday, so I'm into my 50s, and it's just been great so far, except for Arthur, who visits my hips and knee on a regular basis. But Clara, of course, wasn't here to celebrate. So Saturday, before my birthday, we have a a hole in our door, a little mail slot that the mail just goes whoop, through the door and it's there on the floor. And so Saturday before my birthday, there was a huge, like, whoop, and there's like tons of cards all over the floor. And of course I thought, me, they're all for me. Well, they were. My daughter had mailed me 11 birthday cards. And they were in order, and they were all addressed differently. The first one was Mom, 922 Arlington Avenue. The second one was Miss Beverly Robinette, which is my legal name. Then there was Birthday Woman, Mrs. Chip Burkholder, which she thought was really cute. Oprah Winfrey, Carrie Bradshaw, Queen Elizabeth I, Geraldine Granger, which I own very, very proudly, the Vicar of Dibley. And there were several others. You know who was there, and she quickly, when we talked on the phone, said, Mom, that's not Voldemort. That means it's you. It's you. I don't mean Voldemort. But the thing that was that in itself is lovely and wonderful, but the sacred part was, I opened up card number 1, and it says, Happy birthday, Mom. And I can't be there this year to celebrate your birthday, but I wanted to tell you 51 reasons why I'm glad you're my mom. So every card has 5 or 6 reasons, some really funny. Like number 1 is you make the best chocolate chip pancakes. So food is a part of that theme. But these are from a 19-year-old to her 51-year-old mom to say why she's glad I'm her mother. That is sacred. Whew, that touches. The other things, I did bring something visible because my children's art is sacred. So this is Clara. This is Clara's artwork when she was 10 years ago, this year. She entered a contest entitled My Different Kind of Hero, and she drew a picture of her little brother and our cat Mocha. And no prompting from me or her dad. That's what she drew. And it's just one of my it's a sacred piece. So it's framed, and I have it hanging in my art gallery, which is the gallery of my children's art. And my son, who has always had to live in the shadow of his big sister. Any younger kids here who lived in the shadow of your older siblings? I'm an oldest sibling, my brother, bless his heart. But this is my beautiful son's piece of art. And even today at 15, he's still drawing me because he knows that I want something every year, and he's not in art class, so he'll still draw me things so that we can frame them and put them up. So those are sacred to me. I could have brought them all, but I figured you might just want to see 2. But those are sacred. I'm going to put them in the front. So you see, my sacred recipes are not very fancy, and they didn't take theological training. People sometimes think that when you're a theologian or when you're a minister that you have some kind of special claim on the sacred or on and that's not true. In fact, I think I have found more of what is sacred to me when I have stepped back from that role. Every day I work with clients, children and adults, and there are so many sacred moments in those times. And I can't tell you what that means. It's not just emotional. People go, Beverly, you're just such an emotional person. I mean, I am an emotional person. I cry very easily. My children, we were watching the Super Bowl because my son is a big sports fanatic, which do I look? No. But I watched it for him because he wanted to watch it, and I actually learned the day before who was playing, so I could root for whoever. And I know who Lynch is now. I mean, he's a bulldozer. He bulldozes, and but anyway, we were watching it, and my daughter, of course, is watching it at William and Mary, and I'm telling you, the moment that the Budweiser commercial came on with the puppy, I get a text from my daughter, "Are you crying yet?" While my son has already turned around and is snapping a picture of me to send to Clara to say, yes, she's crying. So a lot of times, the challenge is trying to discern what is the visceral feeling of connection, which I consider sacred, and what is really good emotion, which is also positive, but it's not always about being sacred. And I struggle with that because I am a very emotional person, especially now that I'm entering into my 50s. I mean, it's become more so, and I won't look at my husband, so that is always a daily challenge for me. I do know from my own experience that if I don't take time to allow myself to reflect, then I don't connect to the sacred as well. How many of you all, well, I won't ask for a raise of hands, I hope that all of you take time to be. Do you know what that means? Just to be. It's very difficult for a woman in her 50s, me particularly, growing up with the understanding that who you are is what you do, that your worth comes from doing. So my journey in my 40s and 50s has been who I am is enough, and that I need to learn to be. And that's very difficult. I still feel guilty when I sit down in my sunroom, like I did yesterday afternoon with a book, and I may have read 10 pages of the book, but I had a really good nap. But I felt guilty because I wasn't doing. There were things to be done. And I'm working on that because that's where I can feel the sacred. So I have other things to share with you, but I want to have time, and I don't know what time I'm supposed to hush. So what time am I supposed to hush, Wava?
In a couple of minutes.
All right. Well, I'm not going to read anything more for you, but I do want to tell you that other ways that I experience the sacred that it might connect with you are through books. And so I just brought some examples. Miss Tizzy, I read here actually before to the children of the church. Libba Moore Gray was a native of Knoxville, Tennessee. She attended Emory and Henry College but did not graduate. Unfortunately, she died of breast cancer several years ago. But she was she's my favorite children's author. And she wrote Miss Tizzy, and then this one, My Mother Had a Dancing Heart, and She Shared That Heart with Me, is a sacred book about relationship. And then one of my favorite books about the holy is Old Turtle. How many of you all know that? It's a wonderful book. And it's at the Houston, one of the gay men's choruses in Texas. I want to say Houston did the musical rendition of this with Marlo Thomas narrating. And it's absolutely just, it's sacred. So it's a beautiful book about relationships. So those are ways that I experience the sacred. So I'm going to stop